On his deathbed, 87-year-old Walter Braxton finally spoke a secret he had buried for over 60 years. As his family gathered to bid farewell, his voice trembled with regret. "I cheated on your mother, with her best friend, Evelyn." Gasps echoed in the room as the frail man begged forgiveness. His wife, Eleanor, had died a decade prior, never learning of the betrayal. The confession unleashed a storm of emotions, threatening to unravel the family's perception of love, loyalty, and legacy. Walter Braxton lay frail and pale on the hospital bed. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor his only companion for hours. The room smelled of antiseptic, and the air was thick with a kind of solemnity reserved for those standing at death's door. His children, Emma, Charles, and Philip, had arrived one by one, each carrying their own burdens and unspoken fears. They had expected to share memories, perhaps even listen to Walter recount stories of his youth, as people on the brink of death often do. But the words that spilled from their father's lips shattered everything they believed about him. "I have something to confess," Walter began, his voice raspy but deliberate. His eyes, sunken and tired, scanned the room, searching for courage in the faces of his children. Emma, the eldest, leaned forward, her hand gripping the armrest of her chair as though bracing for impact. Charles crossed his arms, a skeptical brow raised. Philip, ever the optimist, managed a faint smile, urging his father to continue. Walter took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with visible effort. "I cheated on your mother, with Evelyn." The words hung in the air like a dense fog, suffocating and heavy. Emma's hand flew to her mouth as she gasped. Charles shot up from his chair, pacing the room in disbelief. Philip's smile vanished, replaced by a look of shock so profound it seemed to age him in an instant. For a moment, no one spoke. The beeping of the monitor seemed deafening. Finally, Emma broke the silence. "Dad, what are you saying? Evelyn, Mom's best friend?" Walter nodded weakly, his gaze dropping to the pristine white sheets covering his fragile frame. "It was a mistake. A terrible mistake. But I can't take it to my grave. You deserve to know the truth." The confession felt like a bomb detonating in the small hospital room, scattering the shards of a life they thought they understood. Walter, the man who had always been a pillar of strength and moral guidance, had just unveiled a secret that reframed everything. Charles was the first to voice his anger. "Are you kidding me, Dad? After all these years, you decide to tell us now? Mom's been gone for 10 years. She died thinking you were the perfect husband." Emma, ever the peacemaker, tried to calm her brother. "Charles, stop. Let him explain. This isn't easy for any of us." But Walter was already speaking again, his voice tinged with both regret and relief. "It happened a long time ago, before you were born, Emma. Your mother and I had just gotten married. Evelyn was always around, and we got too close. It only happened once, but the guilt, it's eaten at me every day since." Philip, who had remained silent until now, finally found his voice. "Did Mom know? Did she ever suspect?" Walter closed his eyes as though searching his memory for an answer. "I don't know. She never said anything. But I think she might have known. She and Evelyn drifted apart not long after. Evelyn moved away, and we never spoke of it again." As the night wore on, Walter's mind drifted back to the moment that had haunted him for decades. He could still remember the sound of the rain that night, the dim light of the room, and Evelyn's laughter echoing softly. It had been a moment of weakness, a fleeting lapse in judgment that had spiraled into a lifetime of regret. He had loved Eleanor deeply, but in that moment, his love had not been enough to stop him. Evelyn's tears the next morning haunted him. "This can never happen again," she had said, and it hadn't. But the damage had been done. Evelyn moved away, and Walter had poured himself into his marriage, determined to be the husband Eleanor deserved. Yet the memory lingered, a shadow that darkened even his happiest moments. Emma, Charles, and Philip sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Emma's mind raced with memories of her childhood, trying to reconcile the father she had adored with the man who had just confessed to such a betrayal. Charles, always quick to anger, found his emotions boiling over. He couldn't understand how his father, the man he had idolized, could have been so weak. Philip, the youngest and most sensitive of the three, felt a profound sadness. He had always believed in the power of love and forgiveness, but this revelation shook him to his core. "Dad," Emma said softly, breaking the silence. "Why now? Why tell us this now, when Mom is gone, and there's nothing we can do to change the past?" Walter's voice was barely a whisper as he replied, "Because I couldn't die with this on my conscience. Your mother deserved better, and I failed her. I've carried this guilt for so long. I just needed you to know the truth. Maybe you can learn from my mistakes." Charles let out a bitter laugh. "Learn from your mistakes? What exactly are we supposed to learn, Dad? That it's okay to betray the people who love you as long as you feel guilty about it later?" "Charles, stop," Emma said, her voice firm. "This isn't the time." But Charles was not easily silenced. "No, Emma. He doesn't get to just drop this on us and expect us to forgive him because he's dying. Mom deserved to know the truth. She deserved the chance to confront him. But now it's too late for her, and it's too late for us to get any answers." Philip, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Dad. Not yet. But I think you were brave to tell us. Even if it hurts, I'd rather know the truth than live with a lie." Walter's eyes filled with tears. "I don't expect your forgiveness. I just needed to tell you. I needed to set things right, even if it's too late." As the hours passed, the siblings sat with their father, the weight of his confession hanging over them like a storm cloud. They shared stories of their childhood, trying to find some semblance of normalcy in the midst of the chaos. But the bond between them had been irrevocably changed, and they all knew that nothing would ever be the same. The silence following Walter's confession stretched beyond the hospital room. Even after the siblings returned to their respective homes that night, the weight of their father's revelation clung to them like a shadow. Emma sat in her living room, clutching an old photo album. She flipped through pictures of their mother, Eleanor, laughing with her best friend Evelyn at barbecues and birthdays. How could Evelyn have betrayed her so deeply? Charles, on the other hand, found solace in anger. He spent hours pacing his garage, muttering to himself, replaying the words his father had said. He couldn't shake the image of his mother smiling at Evelyn, trusting her implicitly, while behind closed doors, the truth festered. Philip sat on the edge of his bed, staring at a picture of his parents on their wedding day. His father looked so proud, so full of love. How could that love have faltered so quickly? The next morning, they reconvened at Emma's house, each looking more haggard than the last. Charles wasted no time diving into his grievances. "I can't believe he did this. To Mom, to us, and Evelyn. She was like family. How could they both do this?" Emma poured coffee, her hands trembling. "I've been thinking about Mom and Evelyn all night. I mean, they were inseparable. Evelyn was there for every big moment in Mom's life. Weddings, birthdays, even when we were born. And then she just disappeared. Do you remember how suddenly it happened?" Philip nodded. "I do. I remember asking Mom why Evelyn stopped visiting. She said Evelyn moved for work, but now I wonder if that was the real reason." Their conversation took a turn when Emma revealed she had something to show them. She led them to the attic, where she had uncovered a dusty old box labeled Eleanor's Keepsakes. Inside were photos, letters, and mementos of their mother's life. Emma handed Charles a yellowed envelope. "This one is addressed to Evelyn." Charles hesitated before opening it. The letter, written in Eleanor's elegant cursive, began with pleasantries but quickly shifted in tone. "Evelyn, I felt a distance between us lately, and I can't help but wonder why. Did I do something to upset you? Please, if I've hurt you in any way, let me make it right. Your friendship means everything to me." Emma and Philip exchanged a glance. "She knew something was wrong," Emma whispered, but Charles wasn't convinced. "This doesn't prove anything. It just shows that Mom noticed Evelyn pulling away. She might not have known about the affair." As they sifted through more letters, a pattern began to emerge. Eleanor had written several notes to Evelyn during the time frame their father had mentioned. Each one was a plea for clarity, for understanding. The siblings were left with more questions than answers. Did Eleanor ever confront Evelyn? Did she discover the truth and choose to remain silent? That afternoon, they decided to visit Walter again. They needed answers, even if they weren't ready to hear them. Walter's condition had worsened overnight, his breathing shallow, his skin pale. But his eyes lit up when he saw his children enter the room. "Dad," Emma began cautiously, "we found some of Mom's letters to Evelyn. She wrote about feeling distant from her. Did she ever ask you about it? Did she know?" Walter's gaze softened and he closed his eyes for a moment. "Your mother was perceptive. She knew something was wrong, but she never asked. At least, not directly. I think she chose to protect herself. To protect all of you. She was stronger than I ever deserved." Philip's voice cracked as he asked, "Did Evelyn ever try to reach out after she left?" Walter shook his head weakly. "No, that was part of the agreement. We promised to never speak of it again. She moved away to give us a chance to heal, to start over, but I carried the guilt with me every day." Charles, his anger still simmering, leaned forward. "And you think that makes it okay? That you stayed silent all these years, while Mom had to live with that?" Walter's eyes welled with tears. "It doesn't make it okay. Nothing can. But I thought I was doing the right thing by burying it. I thought if I could be a better husband, a better father, it would erase what I'd done. I was wrong." The siblings left the hospital that day with a mixture of emotions. Walter's words had provided some clarity, but the wounds were still raw. Emma decided to dig deeper into their mother's life, hoping to uncover more pieces of the puzzle. Charles remained distant, his trust in their father shattered. Philip, ever the mediator, tried to find a way to bridge the gap between them. That evening, Emma couldn't stop thinking about Evelyn. The vibrant, confident woman she remembered from her childhood now seemed like a stranger. What had driven her to betray her best friend? And why had she stayed silent all these years? Emma decided to do something she hadn't considered before: search for Evelyn. She spent hours online, combing through social media profiles and public records. It was a long shot, but she needed answers. The days following Walter's confession brought a tense silence among the siblings. They communicated sparingly, each grappling with their own emotions. Emma's search for Evelyn consumed her nights, while Charles buried himself in work, using his anger as fuel to avoid addressing the hurt. Philip, caught between his siblings' vastly different reactions, felt the growing rift between them and longed to restore the fragile connection. Emma finally broke the silence when she called her brothers one evening. "I found her," she said, her voice a mix of determination and trepidation. "I found Evelyn." Charles was incredulous. "You've got to be kidding me, Emma. Why would you even look for her? Haven't we been through enough?" "Because we need answers," Emma snapped. "If there's even a chance she can explain what happened, don't you think we deserve to know?" "I don't care about her excuses," Charles shot back. "She's just as guilty as Dad, maybe worse. She betrayed Mom." Philip intervened, his tone conciliatory. "Charles, let's hear her out. If Emma's willing to talk to her, I think it might help us understand something." Despite their disagreements, they all agreed to meet Evelyn together. Emma had arranged for a meeting in a small cafe in the town where Evelyn now lived. The idea of confronting the woman who had upended their family's perception of the past filled each of them with unease, but they couldn't let the opportunity slip away. When they walked into the cafe, they immediately spotted Evelyn. Time had softened her once striking features, but her piercing blue eyes still held the spark of the woman they remembered. She stood as they approached, her hands trembling slightly as she extended them toward Emma. "Thank you for coming," Evelyn said, her voice heavy with emotion. "I've waited a long time for this." Charles wasted no time. "I'm not here for pleasantries. I want to know why. Why did you do it?" Evelyn flinched at his bluntness but nodded. "You have every right to ask that. Your mother was my best friend. She was like a sister to me, and what I did to her was unforgivable. I've spent decades trying to make sense of it myself." Emma's voice softened as she asked, "Then why? If you cared about her so much, why betray her like that?" Evelyn looked down at her hands, her expression pained. "It wasn't planned. It wasn't something either of us wanted. Your father and we were both young and foolish. It was a moment of weakness, and I regretted it the second it happened. But the damage was done." Philip, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "Did Mom know? Did she ever confront you?" Evelyn shook her head. "She never confronted me directly, but I think she knew. There was a change in her after that. She became guarded. I tried to keep our friendship alive, but I could see the hurt in her eyes every time she looked at me. That's why I left. I thought, if I disappeared, it would give her a chance to heal." Charles scoffed. "And you think running away made it better? You think leaving her to deal with the fallout by herself was noble?" "I wasn't trying to be noble," Evelyn admitted. "I was trying to do the only thing I thought I could. Staying would have only made things worse. I thought I was doing the right thing by leaving, by cutting myself out of her life." Emma's heart ached as she listened. She had always believed her mother was a woman of immense strength, but the thought of Eleanor silently carrying the weight of Evelyn's betrayal was almost too much to bear. "Did she ever forgive you?" Emma asked. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know. I wrote her letters over the years, but I never sent them. I didn't have the courage to face her. And now, it's too late." The conversation left the siblings with more questions than answers. As they drove home, the silence in the car was thick with unspoken thoughts. Charles stared out the window, his anger simmering but directionless. Emma gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind replaying Evelyn's words. Philip, sitting in the back seat, felt the weight of their family's unraveling pressing down on him. When they returned home, Emma went straight to her attic and retrieved their mother's keepsake box. She sifted through the letters and journals, searching for anything that might offer clarity. Hours later, she found an entry that stopped her cold. "I know Evelyn is hiding something," Eleanor had written. "She's grown distant, and Walter won't meet my eyes when I mention her name. I don't know what to think, but I feel as though I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, and one wrong step will send everything crashing down." Emma clutched the journal to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Her mother had known, or at least suspected, and yet she had chosen to stay. But why? To protect her children? To preserve the illusion of a perfect family? Emma didn't know if she admired her mother's resilience or mourned the sacrifices she had made. The next morning, she shared the journal entry with her brothers. Charles read it with a mixture of disbelief and rage. "She deserved better," he muttered. "She deserved the truth." Philip, ever the mediator, tried to find a silver lining. "Maybe she stayed because she loved us, because she wanted us to have a stable home." "But at what cost?" Emma asked. "She carried this pain with her until the day she died, and now we're left to pick up the pieces." The siblings sat in silence, each grappling with the legacy of their parents' choices. Walter's confession had shattered the foundation of their family, but the truth was far more complicated than they had imagined. As they faced the painful reality of their parents' imperfections, they were left with a question that had no easy answer. Could they ever truly move forward, Or would the past forever haunt them? The siblings gathered at Emma's house once again, drawn by the need to uncover the truth hidden within their mother's keepsake box. The journal entry they had discovered earlier haunted them, its words a glimpse into Eleanor's unspoken anguish. Emma placed the box on the table, her fingers lingering on its edges as if hesitant to open it. "This might be the last chance we have to understand her," Emma said softly, glancing at her brothers. "Are we ready for this?" Charles crossed his arms, his face tense. "Do we really need to know more? It's already unbearable." "Mom carried these things for a reason," Philip said, trying to stay calm. "Maybe they'll help us make sense of everything." Emma opened the box and pulled out a bundle of letters, tied neatly with a faded ribbon. "These look like letters between Mom and Evelyn," she murmured. The siblings exchanged uneasy glances. Emma carefully untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter, dated decades earlier. The handwriting was Evelyn's, elegant and precise. "Eleanor," Emma read aloud, "I know I've hurt you, though you may not yet know the extent of my betrayal. I've made a terrible mistake, one I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I can't ask for forgiveness, but I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you." The room fell silent as the weight of Evelyn's words sank in. Emma unfolded the next letter, one of their mother's responses. "Evelyn," she read, "I don't know what you've done, but your distance has hurt me more than words can say. You were my sister in every way but blood. Whatever it is, I hope you can find the courage to tell me. Our friendship deserves that much." "She didn't know at the time," Philip said quietly. "At least, not yet." The siblings continued reading the letters, which became increasingly strained as Evelyn's guilt clashed with Eleanor's growing confusion. Eventually, the letters stopped. "She must have found out," Charles said, his voice tight. "That's why Evelyn disappeared." Emma nodded. Mom stopped responding because she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The discovery left them shaken, but Emma wasn't finished. She reached deeper into the box and pulled out a second journal, smaller and older than the one they had read earlier. Inside were unsent letters Eleanor had written to herself, private confessions that bared the struggles she had hidden from everyone. Emma flipped to a page that caught her eye and began to read. "Walter has been distant lately. I see the way he tenses when I mention Evelyn's name. I don't want to believe there's something between them, but the thought keeps me awake at night. If it's true, if they've betrayed me, I don't know if I have the strength to face it. But I can't leave. Not for me, not for the children. They deserve a home, even if it's built on lies." Tears streamed down Emma's face as she closed the journal. "She knew," she whispered. "She knew, and she stayed." Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I can't do this," he said. "This is too much. Knowing Dad betrayed her was bad enough, but now this? She sacrificed everything for us. How are we supposed to live with that?" "Charles, wait," Philip said, but his brother was already heading for the door. Before leaving, Charles turned back to them, his voice trembling with emotion. "You can keep digging if you want, but I'm done." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving the room heavy with his absence. Philip sighed and placed a comforting hand on Emma's shoulder. "He just needs time," he said. "This is a lot to process." Emma nodded and returned to the journal, flipping through its pages for some semblance of closure. Near the end, she found an entry dated just months before Eleanor's death. She read it aloud, her voice quivering. "I've carried this weight for so long, but I don't regret staying. My children are my strength, my reason for enduring. If they never know the truth, I hope they'll at least remember me as someone who loved them more than anything." Emma's voice broke as she finished. "She stayed for us," she said. "She sacrificed everything so we could have a stable life." Philip wiped a tear from his cheek. "She was stronger than any of us realized. But maybe we don't have to carry this burden the way she did." Maybe it's time to let it go. Emma wasn't sure she could, but she nodded anyway. Maybe, she said softly, though the uncertainty in her voice was clear. Charles didn't return Emma's calls for days after storming out, leaving his siblings to navigate their grief and confusion alone. Emma buried herself in organizing their mother's belongings, hoping to find something that would help them make sense of the tangled web of secrets. Philip stayed by her side, quietly offering his support, though he too struggled to process everything they had learned. One rainy afternoon, as Emma sorted through a box of family photos, her fingers brushed against an envelope wedged beneath a frame. Her breath caught as she read the words written in her mother's familiar handwriting. To my children. The envelope was sealed and untouched, as though it had been waiting for this exact moment. "Philip," she called out, her voice trembling. He rushed into the room, worry etched across his face. "What is it?" he asked. Emma held up the envelope. "It's a letter, from Mom. For us." Philip's eyes widened. She must have known we'd find it someday. Emma carefully opened the envelope, her hands shaking. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age but still legible. As Emma unfolded it, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. Her mother's handwriting, steady and deliberate, was like a voice reaching across time. "My dearest Emma, Charles, and Philip," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means you've uncovered the truths I hoped you'd never have to face. I am sorry for the pain this may bring, but I need you to know that every choice I made out of love for you." Emma's voice broke as she read aloud, and tears blurred her vision. Philip placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes filling with tears. She continued, her voice trembling. "I knew your father's heart strayed once, and I knew Evelyn's betrayal cut deeper than I could admit. But I chose to stay because I believed our family was worth saving. I couldn't bear the thought of tearing your world apart." Philip wiped his eyes as Emma paused to collect herself. "She stayed for us," he said softly. Emma nodded and continued. "It wasn't easy. There were nights when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But every time I looked at you three, I knew I had made the right decision. You were my light in the darkness, my reason for enduring." Emma handed the letter to Philip, who read the final lines aloud. "I forgave your father, though it wasn't easy, and it took time. I forgave Evelyn in my heart, even if I couldn't bring myself to say it to her face. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to let the pain consume you. I hope, one day, you'll find it in your hearts to forgive too. You are my legacy, my greatest gift to this world. Love, always, Mom." The room was silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. Emma wiped her tears and looked at Philip. "She was so much stronger than we ever realized." "She was," Philip agreed, "and she wanted us to be strong too, to move forward." Later that evening, Emma called Charles. He didn't answer, so she left him a voicemail. "Charles, I found something you need to see. It's from Mom. Please call me back." To her surprise, Charles showed up at her doorstep the next morning, his face drawn and weary. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice gruff. Emma handed him the letter. "Read it. All of it." Charles sat down, the weight of the letter heavy in his hands. As he read, his tough exterior began to crumble. By the time he finished, tears streamed down his face. "She forgave them," he said, almost in disbelief. "After everything, she forgave them." "She did it for us," Emma said gently, "because she loved us." Charles shook his head. "I don't know if I can do that. Forgive Dad. Forgive Evelyn. It feels impossible." "It's not about them," Philip interjected. "It's about us, about letting go of the anger so we can move on. Mom didn't want this to break us." Charles stared at the letter for a long moment before finally nodding. "I'll try," he said quietly. for her. The siblings spent the rest of the day together, sharing memories of their mother and reflecting on the legacy she had left behind. It wasn't easy, and the wounds were still raw, but for the first time in weeks they felt a flicker of hope. That evening, Emma visited Walter in the hospital. His condition had worsened, his breathing shallow and labored. She sat by his bedside and held his hand. "Dad," she said softly, "we found a letter from Mom. She forgave you." Walter's eyes filled with tears. "She was too good for me," he whispered. "I never deserved her forgiveness." "She forgave you because she loved you," Emma said, "and because she wanted us to forgive too." Walter nodded weakly, his gaze distant. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "For everything." "I know," Emma replied, her tears falling freely. "We're trying to forgive. It's what she would have wanted." As Emma left the hospital that night, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in weeks. The pain of the past lingered, but her mother's words had given her a way forward. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Walter Braxton's breathing grew more labored with each passing day, his frail body clinging to life as his family struggled to reconcile his confession with the man they thought they knew. Emma, Charles, and Philip took turns sitting at his bedside, each lost in their own thoughts. The hospital room, once sterile and impersonal, had become a space of reflection, now filled with photographs, flowers, and reminders of the life Walter had lived. It was Charles who finally spoke. One rainy afternoon, he sat beside his father, his jaw tight and his face a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Dad," he began, his voice rough, "I don't know if I can forgive you. What you did, it broke something in me." Walter's eyes fluttered open, his gaze tired but steady. "I never expected your forgiveness," he rasped, "but I needed you to know the truth before it was too late. I owed it to your mother, and to all of you." Charles clenched his fists, his voice shaking. "Mom deserved better," he said finally. "She deserved the truth." Walter nodded weakly. "She was the best of us," he whispered, "and I failed her. But I loved her, Charles, more than you'll ever know." Charles swallowed hard, his bitterness slowly giving way to something softer. "She forgave you," he said after a long pause. "Somehow, she found it in her heart to forgive you. I don't know if I can." Walter's lips trembled. "You don't have to," he whispered. "But I hope, one day, you'll let go of the anger. Not for me, for yourself." That evening, Emma and Philip joined Charles at the hospital. The three siblings sat together, the tension between them easing as they spoke about their mother. Emma placed her hand gently on Walter's arm, her voice calm, yet firm. "Dad," she said, "we've been talking. About Mom. About everything." Walter turned his head slightly toward her, his expression one of quiet resignation. "And?" he asked. "We're trying," Emma continued, "to forgive. It's not easy, but we're trying. Because that's what she would have wanted." Philip nodded. "She didn't want us to carry this anger forever. She wanted us to be happy." Walter's lips trembled and tears slid down his cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't deserve it, but thank you." The room fell silent, save for the soft beeping of the monitor and the sound of rain tapping against the window. Forgiveness, they realized, wasn't about absolving Walter. It was about freeing themselves. Walter passed away 2 days later, his children by his side. His final moments were peaceful, his breaths slowing until they stopped altogether. Emma held his hand until the end, her tears falling freely as she whispered, "We forgive you, Dad." The funeral was a quiet affair, attended by close friends and family. As the siblings stood by the gravesite, the weight of their shared loss settled over them. Emma placed a single white rose on the casket, her thoughts drifting to their mother. "I hope they're together now," she said softly. "They are," Philip replied with quiet conviction. I know they are." Charles, who had remained silent throughout the service, finally spoke. "Mom was the glue that held us all together, and even now, she still is." In the weeks that followed, the siblings began the slow process of healing. Emma returned to her attic one last time, sorting through the final remnants of their parents' lives. She found another journal, this one filled with happy memories their mother had recorded over the years. One entry, dated years ago, stood out. "Today was perfect," the entry read. The kids were laughing, Walter was smiling, and for a moment, everything felt right. These are the moments I live for, the moments that remind me why I chose to stay. Emma closed the journal, a bittersweet smile playing on her lips. Her mother's resilience, her ability to find joy even in the darkest times, had been the foundation of their family. It was a legacy worth honoring. Philip, ever the optimist, suggested a family dinner to celebrate their parents' memory. "We need to remember the love," he said, "not just the pain." Charles reluctantly agreed, and for the first time in years, the siblings sat together around a table, laughing, reminiscing, and reconnecting. They shared childhood stories, moments of joy, and even tears, rebuilding the connection they feared had been lost. Toward the end of the evening, Emma went to the attic again and brought down a box filled with keepsakes, items that once belonged to Eleanor and Walter. She handed Philip an old photograph of their parents on their wedding day. The joy in their faces was undeniable. "They had their struggles," Emma said, "but they loved each other. I think that's what mattered most." Philip nodded, turning the photograph in his hands. "Love isn't perfect," he said softly, "but it's real, and that's enough." As the evening came to a close, Emma raised her glass. "To Mom and Dad," she said, her voice steady, "for teaching us about love, even when it wasn't perfect." The siblings clinked their glasses, a sense of peace settling over them. Forgiveness, they realized, wasn't a single act. It was a journey, and for the first time, they were ready to take it together.